And our next panel is going to talk about some of those tools, as well as how compliance as a service empowers businesses, drives towards mainstream adoption, and facilitates financial inclusion. Tom Robinson from Elliptic and Amit Sharma from Finclusive will be our guests on this panel discussion. And Candace Kelly, SDF's General Counsel, will be moderating the discussion. Candace, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And I will say that not only is the Vibrant app an incredible technological tool, but it is also a beautiful one. So even if you're not sending money to Argentina, I encourage you to download it just to see the amazing work that our design team did on that. So I'm Candace Kelly, and I'm here with Amit Sharma, the CEO and founder of Finclusive, and Tom Robinson, the chief scientist and co-founder of Elliptic. And I want to make sure first that everyone's with us. Amit, are you here?
Yes, ma'am, I'm here. I hope you can hear me.
Great, yes. And Tom, I see you're joined as well. Fantastic. So first I want to give just a little bit of background. Finclusive, for those of you who are not familiar, both of these, Elliptic and Finclusive, are both really important members of the Stellar ecosystem. Finclusive is a hybrid fintech, regtech company, and it's focused on inclusion of the underbanked and underserved through compliance, which we'll get into a little bit, because I don't know if that is always the association that you have, inclusion and compliance. So we'll hear from Amit about that. And I think it's also important to note that Amit comes from, he started as a Peace Corps volunteer and worked in the banking sector, also was at Treasury post 9/11, which was the birth time of the many regulations that we have that were really enacted in that moment post 9/11 of never again, and how are we going to prevent the next attack, as opposed to the traditional law enforcement outlook, which was more, how do we catch the bad guys after they've committed their crimes? So very different mindset happened after 9/11. And Tom has been in the crypto space and actually developed the first crypto analytics software in 2014. And Elliptic, as many of you know, is a blockchain analytics company that is integrated with the Stellar network. So I want to start, you both have services that are available for use by Stellar ecosystem partners. So I want to start by having you each describe what those services are. We can start with Tom.
Thank you, Candace, and thank you very much for having me here today. So me and my co-founders started Elliptic back in 2013, and our real underlying aim was to help crypto and the crypto industry to grow. And the big challenge we saw at that time was the issue of financial crime. At that time, the Silk Road dark marketplace was in its heyday, and the main association people had with crypto was with criminality. But we saw a solution to this through the transparency of the blockchain. And so we built the first compliance tool based on blockchain analytics. So what these tools do is basically allow crypto service providers, such as exchanges, to distinguish between regular, completely legitimate customer activity and activity that might relate to criminal activity or the laundering of criminal proceeds. So these tools are now used by most crypto service providers, most exchanges, custodians, payment service providers, in order to meet their regulatory obligations and protect themselves from financial crime.
Great, and just a little known anecdote, Silk Road was prosecuted out of New York, but the lead defendant was arrested here in the library that's about 3/4 of a mile from my home, and processed through the U.S. Attorney's Office here when I was still there. So I am one of those whose first interaction with cryptocurrency was in the context of criminal activity, both there and I was running national security. Anyway, on that tangent, I will shift back to Amit to talk a little bit about Finclusive and the services that you have available to help folks in the ecosystem.
Thanks, Candace. Hope you can hear me okay.
Yes.
Finclusive takes, as you rightly pointed out, a compliance as a service approach to driving inclusion. And as you pointed out, we are a hybrid fintech and regtech company. So the regtech side of this is compliance as a service. And it's in recognition that as compliance activities have continued to grow in the nature of and depth of requirements that regulators have needed, from onboarding and know your customer and know your business and due diligence and enhanced due diligence, monitoring, transaction analytics and tracking and the like. There are a whole slew of activities that financial services providers, traditional, non-traditional, bank, non-bank alike, need to implement. And often they go to, on average, 7 to 10, upwards of 12 to 15 point solutions to do this panoply of activities. So as a result, institutions face a burdensome, redundant, and inefficient overall anti-money laundering or compliance set of tools. So in recognition of that, and in recognition of the inefficient nature of point solutions, we said, why don't we break down that inefficiency and bring a compliance as a service platform, API enabled, web-based and UI enabled as well, that is an amalgam of some tools that we have created in-house proprietarily, and then really partnered with really innovative solutions in the marketplace, like Elliptic in the context of transaction analytics on the crypto and blockchain, to do these full service activities. And it just makes it that much easier for organizations to then plug in to get a fulsome nature of anti-money laundering services. Some just need some of them need the whole ambit. What we have seen in the marketplace, especially in the growth of financial services outside of mainstream traditional banking, is that they're much more tech-enabled and tech-savvy. They're looking for a single point of entry and interoperability across those various capabilities, and they want it API-enabled. And that's where CAS, as a broader product for the sector, is important. And again, we are very open to work with other providers that do things well and integrate them in ways that CAS can be a force multiplier for organizations. Why Stellar? Well, Stellar, its commitment to inclusion is certainly thematically aligned with ours. And we believe that compliance, historically, taken from your description of our backgrounds and mine, we've looked at, and I was part and parcel of the growth of anti-money laundering requirements that befell not only traditional institutions, but the growing nature of alternative non-bank FIs like fintech and virtual asset service providers and the like. And we said, wait a second, a lot of de-risking or pushing out or denial of services to segments of the economy that really need financial services access securely and safely. So we wanted to bring down those barriers, largely rolling up to compliance issues vis-a-vis efficiency and cost and quote unquote high risk sectors, and say, let's bring a robust compliance as a service capability, and then in tandem with that, plug into financial services ecosystems like Stellar that enable inclusion, and then we partner with US banks. That way we are an on-off ramp here in the US through our anchor. And so in addition to the compliance services that we can provide to other anchors, we can now facilitate connectivity to US institutions for the provisioning of insured accounts and the movement of funds into and out of that system.
So I want to follow up on that, Ahmed. I mean, the whole point of the system, the compliance system and then the rules, is to protect consumers. It's to ferret out the bad actors and make sure that they don't have access. So I want to delve a little bit deeper into this notion that your approach to compliance is actually fostering inclusion, because it seems like, isn't that at the cost of just creating an open marketplace for illicit activity? Isn't that what the folks who you worked with to create these rules back post 9/11 would say?
Well, let's face it. What we did in a post 9/11 world, understandably, the pendulum swung quite a bit. It was very driven by law enforcement intelligence, trying to ascertain and understand better the activities of illicit actors in the system, in the financial services ecosystem. Now, what we inadvertently did, unintended perhaps, was we labeled certain actors, certain parts of our economy, certain sectors, certain jurisdictions as high compliance risk. And as a result of that, many traditional institutions looked at those parts of the economy as simply too high cost of compliance or just not worth the value of that business. And as a result, the disproportionate impact has been on whom? Low and moderate income, global poor, unbanked and underbanked, nonprofit organizations, international correspondent banks, money service businesses, and increasingly in the last 5+ years, folks in the crypto or virtual asset services space that are just labeled or misperceived as broadly higher compliance risk. So first off, it's changing the ethos from compliance being an exclusionary practice, which inherently it is, to one that's inclusionary, one that actually engages more in the system so that we have greater transparency and greater security. The second aspect is in leveraging the tools and the analytics and the capabilities to enhance and modernize both the efficiency of compliance, but also the business intelligence value of compliance. And so if I have to redundantly do KYC verifications on a particular client over and over and over again in the same institution when I provide new products or services, that's inherently inefficient. But we can create efficiencies through technology so that we can do near instant verifications and validations. We can do instantaneous analytics with tools like Elliptic. We can interdict versus after the fact go back and do look backs and the like. So you're creating efficiency in the system. And the final aspect is you buy 2 items on Amazon, they know your buying history, their marketing to you, etc. But I tell you, we collect all this information through the KYC, KYB process, and it's stuck in the back office of a compliance division of a bank. We don't leverage this inherent business intelligence for value in the front office and the service orientation of institutions. And instead, we ought to look at the end of the day, anti-money laundering comes down to one question: do you know your customer? And it shouldn't be just, do you know your customer so as to ensure and ascertain the risk they pose, but the opportunities they pose for you to provide additional value. And if we can do that, we will have changed compliance from a exclusionary back office cost burden to an inclusionary, profit-oriented, service orientation, business intelligence value.
Got it. So it sounds like being more efficient and being able to leverage that process and the various different processes and the information that's gathered will allow for better ability to know all customers, not only the customers that on the surface appear to not present a risk. Is that a fair?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And inherently what we are doing is we are literally throwing the baby out with the bathwater. When we label the crypto or vast community as inherently potentially vulnerable to money laundering risks, we tell every financial institution that, wait a second, there is an inherent risk there when there ought not to be. So if you understand that the nature of those activities in a much more granular way, we can actually engage those activities not only safely, but in ways that provide services securely and meet our AML and financial crimes compliance obligations in tandem. So inclusion is really baked in. And this is changing. We instead of regulators providing constant guidance on, wait a second, guys, nonprofit organizations don't all carry the same risks. Well, no kidding. We should be understanding of those and understand the risk-based approach, which is what the compliance regime is asking. And then the secondly is really looking at those fringes of the economy that really can take advantage of new technology applications, in particular financial technologies, and as we've seen, tremendous potential in leveraging blockchain networks and virtual asset service provider activities to engage folks to be able to get into the system, into the financial system in ways that provide that value. And by doing so, we're that much more effective, but we actually meet the goals of AML, which is financial sector resilience and economic security.
Switching over to you, Tom, as we heard, those of us who were able to tune into the conversation between Representative Davidson and Donnell yesterday, you heard him lamenting that many of his colleagues on the Hill still believe that crypto is really just a tool for criminals and illicit activity. So Tom, based on your work and the analytics that you have on not just the Stellar blockchain, but others, does the data back up those fears and concerns?
In a word, no. And I think that one of the big challenges that the crypto industry has faced over the past few years has been an image problem that isn't backed up by reality. So I think a lot of this stems from the inaccurate belief that crypto transactions are anonymous and untraceable, when of course they aren't. And in fact, the traceability of crypto is being used every day by law enforcement investigators to identify criminals and bring them to justice. If you actually look at the blockchain data, as we can, and quantify the proportion of transactions that are actually associated with illicit activity, what you see is that less than 0.5% are associated with criminal activity. Now that has come down significantly over the years. Back in the Silk Road days, that proportion was very high, close to 30%. But what's happened in the interim has, first of all, speculation as a use case has taken off and dwarfs illicit activity. The regulatory environment has matured. Exchanges are now checking for funds linked to criminality and blocking those funds. And third, law enforcement capabilities have really advanced to the point where they can quite efficiently now identify who's behind a dark marketplace, for example, and prevent them from operating. So no, the data simply doesn't back up the belief that crypto is primarily used by criminals.
That's super helpful information. And I think those of us who work in the policy space, we had an earlier panel today about education. And it's really heartening to know that those educational efforts are going to be backed up by the data. And Tom, I understand that you actually engaged in conversations with FATF and I think FinCEN and presented some of that data. Can you tell us a little bit about those meetings, what their concerns were, and how they responded to the data that you were able to present?
Yeah, so I think this was related to the travel rule and the introduction of the travel rule. So when the FATF was considering applying travel rule requirements on crypto businesses, they held a private sector consultation process, which we were involved in. And one of the things they were particularly interested in was what proportion of crypto transactions are peer-to-peer, i.e. just between personal wallets, and what proportion are between institutions such as exchanges. And the reason they're interested in that is that the travel rule means that if a service provider such as an exchange is sending funds to another service provider, they need to send information on the originator and beneficiary identity. Now, of course, that kind of rule was designed for a financial system that is intermediated by financial institutions. But of course, in crypto, you have the choice of using an exchange or just transacting completely peer-to-peer. So what our data shows is that about 40% of all crypto transactions are peer-to-peer and don't involve exchanges or other service providers in any other way. However, that doesn't mean that there are basically two separate financial systems, a peer-to-peer one and an intermediated one. Actually, about 90% of all crypto passes through an exchange or other service provider eventually. So I think this has a big impact on how effective the travel rule will be in crypto, because if people have the option of not transacting through exchanges, but instead moving to a peer-to-peer model, what does that mean for the aims of the travel rule? Is it actually going to provide the information that law enforcement needs? I think that's the big question.
Yeah, and it seems that now that the travel rule is sort of applying to both traditional and crypto, there's now talk of lowering the threshold from the $3,000 to $250,000. And I noted that earlier this week, there was someone from a policy lead from FinCEN at a V20 VAST conference who said criminals are using smaller value transfers and virtual currencies to facilitate terrorist financing, narcotics trafficking, and other illicit activities like cybercrime. And that was the explanation for the proposal to lower that threshold from $3,000 to $250. So from your two different perspectives, I'm curious to hear what your reaction is, and particularly, Tom, with your noting just now that it's unclear whether the travel rule, even as it stands, is going to help with achieve its aims. How would making this threshold lower help or not help, and is it misguided in any way? So I'll start with you, Amit, on that question.
Yeah, so I understand that the rationale behind this is that criminals and terrorists are engaging in small transactions. So FinCEN have said that the average value of transactions that they see in suspicious activity reports is about $500. And so from that point of view, it does make sense to reduce the threshold to somewhere around that level. I think that the counter argument is that that imposes a cost on both financial institutions and on society as a whole in terms of the cost to comply with that, and also costs related to decreases in privacy. I think what I would say to that is that as we increasingly go to technological solutions in compliance, then scalability increases and the extra burden that this kind of imposes on financial institutions shouldn't be as costly as it once was.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I see that as, particularly given that blockchain transactions are so much less costly than the traditional ways of cross-border payments. It seems like if it's $250, then people are going to send $249. And is there a way similar to structuring that the patterns that can be detected, whether you're a financial institution or not, that just from the immutable ledger are really a better approach to addressing this concern, is looking for patterns of activity as opposed to enforcing the sharing of information of the recipient and sender of the transaction.
Yes, so you can definitely use the visibility of the blockchain to detect that kind of activity. So if you think that two individuals are completely independent, you might be able to see their funds converge on the blockchain, and that indicates that they're actually the same actor effectively. And so you can detect people trying to bypass those kinds of transaction thresholds.
So Amit, I want to turn back to you and on this similar theme, which is are there aspects of blockchain technology that should be leveraged to enhance compliance, enhance our concerns with CFT, AML, as opposed to trying to fit this new technology and this new way of transacting into the old model? So square peg, round hole, versus really leveraging, are we as an industry, as governance, are we leveraging the technology that we have, the immutable ledger, you name it? So interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I not only agree with Tom vis-a-vis some of the remarks related to the travel rule, but this is a classic case of square peg, round hole. You know, and if I just use that example, the issue of the travel rule in its inception of the funds transfer rule to ensure that a sender's information is attached to the payment chain was precisely because of the intermediaries that were involved in the transaction between a sender and receiver, and the explicit utility that would provide for law enforcement or regulators to be able to attach transactions for analysis purposes against a particular investigation. You can imagine everything I just described does not exist in the modern crypto-related transactions that we have been describing. And therefore, applying that same methodology or framework is truly a square peg in a round hole. Secondly, you're absolutely right. There are attributes of blockchain technology that are hugely enabling factors to streamline, make more efficient, and more effective anti-money laundering capabilities. The immutability of the ledger is one case in point. The pseudonymity of transactions allow for both the protection of privacy and the ability to do inward investigation. These attributes are hugely beneficial, and I would argue that if you talk to law enforcement, especially in more modern investigations, these tools and these attributes have actually been the reason for the recent enforcement actions you have seen in the last week, month, etc., because that technology has enabled investigations in ways that traditional financial services just do not. And so the streamlining and in creating of the efficiencies is hugely, hugely important. What it also does is takes away a lot of the redundancies that happen within the context of anti-money laundering activities broadly, and allows for automation in KYC verifications, know your customer verifications as an example, the attachment of other attributes that protect privacy of individuals, but allow for the routing of an identity of a potential wallet or an individual associated with that wallet for purposes of investigation. So these kinds of things are hugely important to just bolster the AML stack, and they are slowly getting better understood as more of us, like Elliptic and Finclusive, are continually doing briefings and or demos for regulators to showcase how this technology can in fact help their intention. But more importantly, we need to now get away from this huge library of requirements that were really designed for the traditional financial services marketplace and reconstitute our thinking for the intents of consumer protection, prudential regulation, and financial system integrity in the domain of financial services activity that we now see. And instead of taking those old rules and trying to shove them into new products, actually understand how the new capabilities and even operational realities of blockchain-enabled transactions truly actually take away a lot of the inherent risks that traditional financial services have seen. And the last, just a great example, de-risking has impacted, for example, correspondent banking. If in a world where a particular institution in West Africa loses its correspondent relationship with a U.S. institution, they end up going to a Lebanese institution that connects to a French institution that connects to the U.S. institution. We have not solved the problem. We've made it more cumbersome. They've just had to do a workaround to actually obtain or retain some correspondent relationship in the U.S. Much of that is alleviated with this technology that allows us to work through either exchanges or peer-to-peer, and it takes away a lot of the inherent risks in that value chain. And so not only the attributes of the technology, being assisting of AML activities broadly, but the results of that being both more modernized financial access, but one that, like I say, I just come back to my soapbox, one that actually can stimulate inclusion, which inherently should be a measure of effectiveness of a reasonable anti-money laundering regime.
Absolutely. Just to build on that, I completely agree with everything Amit said. I think one thing we hear from regulators is that they believe AML regulations are technology neutral. I just don't think that's the case. I think there is the inbuilt assumption that a financial system is intermediated by financial institutions. And with crypto, there's the potential that simply isn't the case. But that doesn't mean that we as an industry should rebel against those regulations. We should go above and beyond to comply with them. But at the same time, we should lobby and we should educate regulators to make sure we have a regulatory regime that is effective, is efficient, and increases inclusion.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the theme of the day is education, education, education. It's so great to hear that that you all are engaged, whether it's with FATF and FinCEN, and I think Amit, we're running out of time, so I haven't had I will mention that everyone should check out Finclusive's rule book, which was drafted with a very wide group of folks to help with compliance and sort of as a self-regulating guide, and that was done in very close coordination with regulators, thanks to Finclusive's leadership on that. So we did get a question that is very specific to the services, and I would encourage anyone who's interested in engaging, Finclusive for their compliance as a service to reach out directly to Amit and his team. Certainly Elliptic, same thing. And so anyway, this was a great conversation, and I think that I'm a believer. Compliance is a path for inclusion, and also we have a lot of education to continue to do with our regulators to make sure that they get on board with that way of thinking. So thank you both so much for all the work you do for the ecosystem and with SDF, and I look forward to working with you.